Biden on the road officially to talk jobs, unofficially trying to help Democrats keep theirs in what's a kind of closing argument for his party 12 days out from the midterms. What he's up to on a day when good GDP numbers are out. Plus, tarmac moment captured on camera you might want to see. And speaking of the midterms, Arizona police say they've got the person who broke into the campaign headquarters of the Democrat running for governor there. She's not saying much about it, but we will. And this broader threat to elections officials since 2020. Plus, never-before-seen body cam footage showing how some Texas officers hesitated to confront the gunman at Robb Elementary, as the state's top cop says his department, in his words, did not fail in its response. Wait till you hear how the victims' families are responding. And mixed messages from a new cancer report out today, why deaths are going down, but more young people are getting the disease. And then our backstory, we go behind the scenes on our team's interviews with Gen Zers who say the Me Too movement didn't go far enough later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and in just the last hour or so, President Biden is laying out his closing economic message to the country ahead of the midterms, and on the heels of some good news, right? That actually maybe there's good signs ahead, even though it might not feel that way right now. You got the president pumping up today's GDP number that shows the country's economy grew by about 2.5% after half a year of decline that got everybody talking about maybe a recession. And today, at this microchip factory in Syracuse you're about to see, the president said that number is proof that what he's doing works. And he says it's a lot better than what the other side's proposing.
It's a fundamental shift, and it's working compared to what the very conservative Republicans are offering these days.
It's a bit of a blur between politics and official business today as he makes this full court press that includes all of his cabinet secretaries getting out on the campaign trail. They are fanning out across the country in states that are going to really matter come, obviously, Election Day. And the where of today's speech, pretty interesting, too. Almost as interesting as the what and why for a couple of reasons. First, we're just 12 days until voting ends, and the president's spending time in New York, a state that voted for him by 23 points. Not like a battleground for him. Why is he there? Well, Governor Kathy Hochul, who you see him with there, may need some help. Polling averages show her race for governor went from kind of a sure thing a month ago to still pretty sure, but hey, a little boost isn't going to hurt. The other reason is that this factory is in what the Cook Political Report describes as a toss-up district, a race that could swing either way. It's one of 10 toss-ups held by a Republican right now, John Katko, who's retiring. Sounds like a lot, so you see Democrats have 23 of them, and it doesn't take much to lose the House right now. Just 5 seats in the red direction will make Kevin McCarthy the next Speaker of the House. Our resident Biden whisperer, Mike Memoli, joins us now. A lot to get to, Mem, and let's start with what we're hearing from the president. This is framed, and it was, as a kind of closing argument ahead of the midterms. It is technically official business. That means the president is there in his White House capacity, as I can see the event still going on behind you. But there is also obviously a political context and backdrop to this, as the president is hoping to boost Democrats around the country.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Hallie. Let me just explain what's happening behind me. You know the old expression, the most dangerous place to be is between Chuck Schumer and a television camera? Well, that was me until about a second ago when the majority leader just finished speaking. Speaking after President Biden, you hear him again now introducing some of the other speakers on stage, including Kathy Hochul, right? This is an example of both the White House trying to go on offense with a really tough message, hitting Republicans, laying out what he thinks is the contrast at stake in the election in a district they hope that they can actually flip from red to blue. But also Kathy Hochul, who's now speaking behind me, she has a much tougher than expected race than any Democrat would have thought in a deeply blue state. So the president doing everything he can to really help her out. But the message was pretty clear that the White House feels that they have a strong economic argument to make, but that's not enough. The president likes to say, don't judge me against the almighty, judge me against the alternative. And he thinks voters need to hear what's at risk if Republicans take over.
Listen to you, ma'am, moderating your tone from the golf whisper to the overclap yell. I mean, that's like expert stuff right there. I want to play a little moment when the president, because listen, you've laid out, I think, the key reason why the president is there today and the key thing that he's talking about, which is the economy. But as you look at the backdrop of the midterms, there's this kind of interesting moment on the tarmac that got captured on camera. You can't hear it really well, but Chuck Schumer basically is talking about that Pennsylvania debate, the one that happened a couple of nights ago between Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman and Republican candidate Dr. Mehmet Oz. Very tight race in Pennsylvania. It is basically neck and neck. You're going to see the president here, I think, in a second. He kind of holds up his fingers and crosses his fingers kind of in this, like, will hope after Schumer said to him, it probably won't hurt us too bad. I mean, this is, like, everybody's talking about what's going on in Pennsylvania and in Georgia and elsewhere around the country, and the president is no exception on that, ma'am.
And think about it, President Biden hasn't had the chance to really talk with Senator Schumer in person in a while, right? The Senate has been out of session for quite a while. And there is no doubt that if Democrats do not win that race in Pennsylvania, they have very little hope of keeping the majority in the Senate. So Chuck Schumer would lose his job as the majority leader. President Biden would lose really an opportunity to do more legislating and would be put in a position of having to go on serious defense, even potential impeachment hearings that would potentially be launched. So the president was asked, talking with Senator Schumer about how really that debate performance that everyone's been talking about played out. And Senator Schumer indicated it wasn't as bad as we thought. So this is an interesting moment, as you highlight, that's really been going viral, lighting up on Twitter. And it really speaks to just how Democrats are walking on eggshells at these moments, really looking for any sign of good news that they can find to balance out with a lot of difficult polling and headwinds across the board.
But also, ma'am, they may still be walking on eggshells even after election night, right? Because Pennsylvania is one of those states, and I think it's important to set the table to this now, 12 days before election night, that we may not be sitting here, Memoli, saying, hey, Pennsylvania went one way or the other. The Senate control is one way or the other on election night. In fact, we very well might not be doing that for a couple of days after the election. If you look back at 2020, and our political unit has broken down these numbers, there were multiple key states, Arizona among them, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, for example, where we didn't have all the vote total on election night, meaning we may be bracing for election week a week and a half from now.
This is very familiar territory for me and for the president, Hallie, because I stood in a parking lot in Wilmington, Delaware for about a week after Election Day in 2020 before we were able to call President Biden the winner. So this is familiar territory. You know what's interesting, though? The president is going to be getting on Air Force One just a few days after Election Day to go to Asia. Important high-stakes summit, the G20 summit in Bali. He might even be meeting face-to-face with President Xi of China and crossing paths with President Putin of Russia. So he's going to have other fish to fry as Democrats really try to closely monitor what could be challenges in those election weeks to come.
Mike Memoli live for us there, right in the thick of it, on the kind of campaign trail, kind of, White House unit official business. Appreciate it, ma'am. So as we talk about economic messaging, let's get into those GDP numbers more, because the president did. Look at the Dow, right? Up earlier on the news. It's now closing just about 200 points ahead. You can see the numbers from the big board there. The S&P and the NASDAQ are down. That's actually because of some tech stuff. We're going to talk about that in a second. Big picture, though, the macro numbers may seem good. The micro numbers, listen, you know this. Everything is more expensive. Prices are up for a whole bunch of stuff, about 8% over the last year. And guess what? That includes mortgage rates, which have now hit 7%, the highest rate since Lose Yourself by Eminem, that classic single, topped the charts back in 2002. For context, if you put 20% down on like a median-priced home last year, your monthly payment was about $1,300. Now, it's $2,300, just about. Let's talk about it with Jake Ward. This is an interesting thing here with the GDP number growing after 6 months of decline. Why did it happen now, and is it going to be a trend, or is this a one-off?
Unfortunately, Hallie, it really does look like a one-off. The economists that I've been speaking to mostly attribute it to the change in the trade deficit, right? That's that difference between what we as a country export versus what we import. And the narrow difference between those two things at this very moment counts toward our GDP. That's why we're seeing this 2.5% increase in GDP over the last period here. The difficulty, of course, is that nobody really expects that to stick around. It really does seem to be a one-off thing. And as we see interest rates continue to go up, that's going to probably crush consumer demand. There's going to be all kinds of bad stuff on the horizon. And that's why the people I'm talking to still say that we should be watching for signs of a recession, possibly as early as next year, Hallie.
Timing-wise, though, early next year isn't going to be necessarily what members of the Democratic or Republican Party are going to want before Election Day, which is only 12 days away,
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, unfortunately, it is the president's bad luck that it is on his watch that all sorts of big macro and microeconomic trends are coming together, right? We're seeing the very good likelihood that exports are probably going to begin fading away. We've seen Saudi Arabia go back on what the White House said was its word to increase production in oils to offset the trouble in Russia. We're seeing all of the forces of aging populations and climate change are going to necessitate huge amounts of of spending on the parts of governments across the world. And, of course, we're seeing this just pesky inflation problem, which means that the central banks have nothing better to do, but, no better option, basically, than to try and crush our ability to borrow money by raising interest rates. So you're going to see companies and individuals having a harder and harder time borrowing the money we need in our economy to basically buy the stuff we need. So you're going to see people buying fewer houses, buying fewer consumer goods. All of that is happening while the president is in office. And so, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any way of dodging the train that's coming down the track at him.
Real quick before I let you go, we showed the graphic. The Dow, the big board, right, was up today. The NASDAQ was down. That's because it focuses on tech stocks. And, not to be indelicate, but some of them are in the toilet after their earnings reports. Now, Amazon today, we saw Meta yesterday. What is up?
Well, these are obviously the tech stocks that we once upon a time held up as the shining example of the bulletproof American economy, right? But unfortunately now we're seeing that they are not immune, right? Meta, the parent company of Facebook, seeing a dismal ad revenue picture, right? That whole industry is falling apart. And that's why they're in trouble. That's why Alphabet's earnings are in trouble. You're seeing even Microsoft, that staid tech stock, even it is having trouble, some of the worst trouble it's had in about 5 years. And then Amazon, at this point, really its only profit center seems to be its cloud business at this point, because of all of these headwinds we were talking about. It costs more to borrow money, it costs more to buy gas, and people are buying fewer things. So even Amazon seeing its stock about 19% down at this hour. So all of this bad news overall for the economy, Hallie.
Jake Ward, good to see you. Thank you. Some new developments now in Texas on the Uvalde school shooting coming into us today with new body cam footage showing Texas public safety troopers responding to that just horrific massacre. The officers talk about having to confront the gunman and their fears about being shot. I want you to watch.
What's the safest way to do this? I'm not trying to get clapped down.
We need to go in there. I wonder if I can get in there. That's what I was thinking. And maybe open that door.
It comes as today. The Texas Department of Public Safety director says his department did not fail the community as he faced parents who lost their children, whose children were murdered, who want him to resign.
I can tell you this right now. DPS is an institution that right now failed the community, plain and simple.
Hundreds of officers responded within minutes to the shooting at Robb Elementary School that day. 19 kids and 2 teachers were killed. Law enforcement waited more than an hour. They waited 77 minutes before actually going into the classroom. Morgan Chesky is joining us now. So let me sort of work this backwards, Morgan, and start with what we heard from the public safety director, who in this just incredibly emotional with the relatives of the victims of the shooting facing them, basically. They were furious. All they want is for him to resign. You heard him say we didn't fail the community, he thinks. That's not going to happen. Where does this go?
Yeah, Hallie, very good question. And what's so interesting about these calls for resignation is that they're not coming from a random place. It was some time ago that Director McCraw, who leads the Texas DPS agency, told those families in Uvalde that should DPS be proven to have failed as an institution, he would then have no choice but to resign. And I think a lot of the frustration and confusion on behalf of the parents today came from the fact that we're now at a place where at least one trooper has been fired as a result of this internal investigation. At least 6 or 7 others are facing potential termination, and they simply do not know what else it will take to create that resignation. And here's what one of the parents had to say face-to-face with the director himself. Take a listen.
If you are a man of your word, then you would retire. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like you're going to do that because you keep talking in circles and doing all that mess and everything. And listen, you can get irritated all you want. I lost my damn son. Your anger is not going to outmatch mine, man.
Wow.
Yeah, and that father, far from the only parent, just really expressing their frustration, their sadness. This is a town that, as this investigation has deepened, really faces a future of perpetual mourning here. Hallie?
The other, I think, humongous headline where you are in Texas, Morgan, is that body cam footage that we showed. We played a little bit of it in the introduction here. You hear one of the officers, one of the troopers, say something like, I'm not going to go in. I don't want to get clapped out, right? Like concern for their own safety, even as these little kids are getting brutally murdered inside that building. There is, it seems as though there has been real fury over that factor. Because it plays into people's biggest fears, right? That, like, the people who are supposed to protect you will not, in fact, do that.
Yeah, Hallie, it absolutely does. And this video that has been obtained by the NBC affiliate WOAI in San Antonio has been out for about 24 hours now. And already we have heard from families of the victims in Uvalde, one of them calling it nauseating and disgusting, since when you hear the audio in that video, it confirms the fact that at least some of those officers were, as you mentioned, more concerned for their own safety than that of the children, that of the teachers who were inside that building. The body cam video that has been obtained shows angles from outside the school, from inside the school, at one point just feet away from the very classroom where the gunman was able to open fire indiscriminately on the children and the teachers. And so it is, you know, if there has been any sort of emotional closure whatsoever, this really only opens up those wounds that people are working so hard to move on from, with this confirming some of these parents' worst fears in that response. Hallie?
Morgan Chesky live for us in Texas. I know that is a tough story to continue to report on. Morgan, thank you. Down to Georgia, because Herschel Walker, the Republican candidate for Senate, is back on the campaign trail. Talking a little bit less about that allegation we brought you last night, that a second woman has now anonymously accused him of pressuring her into having an abortion. Walker is denying that as he hits back at his Democratic opponent, Raphael Warnock.
All of a sudden, you're going to try to throw this abortion thing on me like you think you know what you're talking about.
NBC News cannot independently verify the allegations. That one plus another woman who had previously come forward and said Walker pressured her into an abortion or paid for one in 2009. Walker has denied both of those. As a reminder, he is a candidate who has campaigned largely on a strict anti-abortion platform. Republicans aren't backing away from him. You see these two folks here down in Georgia to help out, boost turnout for Herschel Walker today. And it's a close race, right? Polling averages show Walker trailing Warnock by just a fraction of a percent inside the margin of error overall. Ellison Barber is in Monroe, Georgia. Let me start with Herschel Walker, because in many ways, Ellison, what we have seen is his campaign kind of outsourcing his defense to others in the party, big names, I should say, in the conservative party.
Yeah, I mean, we had this denial, this statement that he made to reporters at a campaign stop yesterday in Dillard, Georgia. And then Walker had an interview with Fox News. And in that interview, he was asked whether or not he knows who this woman is, Jane Doe. And he, in his answer, said, I'm not going to get into any sort of guessing game. I've said this is a lie, and I've moved on. And when you look at the way that he has campaigned today, we were with him at both of his campaign stops. He really has not gone into any detail or touched much on these allegations again at all as he's speaking with supporters. And he's had very lengthy speeches today, and there's really been little to nothing in terms of him commenting on these allegations and aggressively pushing back on it. What we are seeing, though, are his allies kind of picking up that bullhorn, if you will, for the campaign. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham talked a lot about it at the first campaign stop today, essentially arguing that this is all politics. He basically said this is nonsense, it's California nonsense, and we've seen this sort of thing before. And he had a kind of lengthy rant focusing in on that and pushing back on these allegations. But right now, from the Walker campaign, and Herschel Walker specifically, it seems like unless there is some sort of new evidence that Gloria Allred brings forward, that we're not going to really hear him get into any more details about this on the trail or with reporters. It seems like he is taking that approach that he said in the Fox News interview yesterday, and that he said it's a lie, and he's moving on. Hallie?
I was in Georgia earlier this week, down in Savannah on the campaign trail with Senator Raphael Warnock, obviously Walker's opponent. And what was interesting, Ellison, and you know this from being on the trail with him too, Warnock will respond to questions when he get asked, right, about Walker. But what is we've seen in the last 24 hours since the second allegation came out is it seems a sharper tone from his campaign in trying to make this an issue from Herschel Walker.
A very big shift. I mean, I was looking at Senator Warnock's Twitter just before we came on here to talk to you. And since this allegation came to light, he has tweeted attacking Herschel Walker by name 5 times. He also posted a new digital video laying out some of the personal controversies about Herschel Walker. That is so abnormal for Senator Warnock. Throughout this entire campaign, he and his campaign have sort of tried to stay above the quote-unquote messy side of politics. They've let outside groups largely do it. A week ago, we saw them release their first campaign paid ads where they even touched on these controversies surrounding Herschel Walker. And now with this new allegation, hearing from the campaign repeatedly, hearing from the candidate himself it really seems like they are shifting and taking a much more aggressive posture here. And when you look at those polls, it makes sense why. I mean, neither candidate, Hallie, is above the 50% threshold required to avoid a runoff in this state. And we're 12 days away.
Ellison Barber in Monroe, Georgia. You're going to, I'm sure, be on that campaign trail real hard over the next 12 days, Ellison. Thank you so much. Breaking news coming into us here from D.C. as we're coming on the air. The January 6th Select Committee is now finished with their review of more than 1 million documents that the Secret Service handed over. This is according to a source familiar with the committee's plans. Earlier this month, remember, a Secret Service spokesperson told NBC that those documents did not include text messages, but they did include emails, other messages sent electronically. We know the committee has said it plans to re-interview 2 key Secret Service agents who were brought up in some of the past public hearings. They're also considering calling more witnesses to learn more about the agency's work around the events leading up to January 6th. Remember why this is important, right? Because the Secret Service, those agents were around, not just Donald Trump, but Mike Pence, at the time that the Capitol was being invaded on January 6th. That is why the committee wants to know more insight into what was former President Trump trying to do, what was going on as it related to Mike Pence, et cetera. Keeping an eye on that story. As it relates to January 6th, we're also looking at a D.C. judge today handing down one of the longest sentences yet related to the insurrection. Albuquerque Casper Head will serve 7.5 years behind bars after he dragged former D.C. police officer Michael Fanone into the crowd on the steps of the Capitol. Fanone had a heart attack. He had a traumatic brain injury. He's since resigned his position as a police officer. It comes as a jury in the same courthouse that's heading home for the second straight night, apparently deadlocked on a verdict for a Capitol police officer who was charged with obstruction for telling a January 6th rioter to take down a Facebook post about being in the Capitol. Joining us now is Ryan Riley. Ryan, a busy day for you at court, I know. Thank you for scrambling over as it closed. Let me start with this, I don't want to say Fanone verdict, but the one that involves Michael Fanone, because he was there today for the sentencing. And he said, I would trade all of this attention, the attention that he's got because of this attack, to return to policing. He says, but I can't do that. Talk about why this judge gave this defendant so many years. Yeah, so this was the defendant who actually drug him into the crowd, and he sort of tricked Mike Fanone. He said, you know, hey, I'll help you. And in the moment, Mike Fanone said, thank you. And then as he pulls him out, he says, I've got one, and gives him over to the mob. Shortly thereafter, there's a stun gun driven into his neck. So a really, brutal attack. And this is basically what set it off. And they talked about him being sort of the nexus for this. If he hadn't dragged him out into the crowd, none of this other stuff would have happened. So this is a very high-level defendant. So 7.5 years, significant sentence held on there. And I think the judge had some pretty strong words for the defendant, and just speaking more broadly about the lies that we've heard about the 2020 elections and the consequences that we've seen for some of these defendants who actually believe those lies that Donald Trump was telling. Did it surprise you how intense the judge got? She's said some things before along those lines. I think that she has sort of made very clear that, she's frustrated with the fact that people aren't being held accountable for what they've said, And she's talked, in fact, about how a lot of people have turned their anger, a lot of Trump supporters have turned their anger on Mike Fanone, and because he's gotten these voicemails, he's gotten these threats. He's also been public. He's done television. I've talked to them. Other people around networks have talked to him. I mean, he's not been shy about sharing what he's experienced. Not at all, but there's a bunch of vitriol aimed at him instead of, as she said, the person who summoned all of these folks to the U.S. Capitol. As it relates to a different officer, this Capitol Police officer, Michael Riley, he's this officer who apparently tipped off a rioter to take down some videos on social media feeds that showed him going into the Capitol January 6th. We knew last night on the show that one of those verdicts was back, but we couldn't report it because we didn't know what the verdict was. And we still don't know because they're still deliberating. This is a really long time, right, for a jury to be thinking about a verdict in a J6 case. It is, and we found out a little bit more today because at the end of the day, we got this note that said that the deadlock, which refers to one individual, right? So there's one person who is sort of holding this up. So we don't know where they've come down on that. The prosecutors, I can tell you, are very anxious to get that verdict. They've been pushing to say, hey, can we just get the partial verdict here? Can we figure it out? Because ultimately, it actually won't, if they convict him on one, it won't matter in terms of sentencing. But, if it's not guilty on one, that's a whole different, that's a whole different ballgame. Well, maybe we'll talk tomorrow. See if that verdict ends up coming back. Ryan Riley, thank you. Good to see you. A deadly shooting incident on the set of the movie Rust is now in the hands officially of the Santa Fe County District Attorney. You've got the DA's office in a statement saying what comes next is this really thorough review of the info, the evidence in this investigation. It's now going to be up to the DA to decide whether Alec Baldwin or other people could face charges in this whole thing. The Santa Fe sheriff combed through a lot of evidence to put together this very long-awaited case report. It comes just a little over a year since Baldwin fired a prop gun on set, killing cinematographer Helena Hutchins and hurting the movie's director. Baldwin has said the gun went off accidentally and that he did not pull the trigger. Rust Movie Productions has declined to comment to NBC News. We obviously still haven't seen ourselves That case report, the second we do, you know we'll bring you the headlines. Coming up here on the show, RSV cases are up more than 300% in one state compared to what it usually is. So what are they doing about it? How can you stay healthy? What does it mean for your kids or your friends' kids? Plus, while your Thanksgiving turkey is probably going to be a little more expensive this year, and it's not just because of inflation. That's in our 5 things. Scientists are warning folks on Hawaii's Big Island to get ready for maybe a volcano going off. Why they're so worried, coming up in the 5 things. But first, tomorrow is the last day you can get those Treasury Department bonds that are paying more than a 9% interest rate. That is bananas, people. Think about it. Like, think about a return on your money. You can't get that in the stock market right now. You can't get that at like a high-yield savings. You got to get it through Treasury. It's kind of a pain in the behind to do it. Can we be real? You got to buy these Series I bonds and get your confirmation email tomorrow to lock in this rate. You've got to go onto Treasury Direct. There's only one specific way you can do it. That website apparently crashed because there was such high demand. Starting in November, rates are going to drop about expected to, probably down to like 6.5%. So, hey, think about it. Assess it. Does it make sense for you? Let's go to some other stunning new numbers now, telling us how big of an impact this respiratory virus is that we've been talking about. In Arizona, you've got RSV cases up 344% over what's considered a typical season. That is bonkers, 344% higher than what they usually might see. It's happening as new numbers show us that in 16 states, including D.C., hospital beds for kids are at least 80% full, even in states where the temperatures haven't dropped that much yet and kids are still able to be outside. It is still only October. Normally, we see this kind of thing later on in the winter, but doctors say that they are seeing this kind of spike now. Cheyenne Childers' 2-month-old Ryder was one of those patients. He had to stay at the hospital overnight because he had RSV. Here's what his mom said about watching her little baby go through this.
Terrifying. It's a serious illness, you know, with him being this young. He doesn't have an immune system to fight it off.
Dr. John Torres is here now to talk more about this. So we know, Dr. John, hospital beds have been filling up with kids. Even states like Arizona, right? Warmer climate, kids can be outside a little bit longer into the year, et cetera, is now seeing this wild spike in RSV. Talk about when this may get better because of how unusual this is.
Well, this is unusual because it's happening so early, and it's not necessarily the numbers, it's just when the numbers are happening, because they typically, the peak season is December through February. We're a month and a half before that. So what we don't know is what's going to happen over the next month and a half. Are cases going to continue to go up like they have been, or will they finally plateau and even start to come down at some point? And so that's the thing that has people concerned. Like you mentioned, 80% of the hospital beds are full, but if you look at the ICUs in some places, it's in the 90% that they're full. Anytime they get above 85%, that's when they start getting worried and they start doing contingency plans to get children out to other areas and to bring extra staff in. So they're getting to that point in a lot of areas right now. We just don't know where it's going to go from here.
It's not just RSV, right? COVID, the flu is the reason why experts have talked about, as we've talked about on the show, a triple-demic. Are we seeing any signs over the last couple of days here that we're starting to get a handle on some of this?
Yeah, and we're not seeing signs on that because we're seeing flu go up. We're seeing RSV go up at this point. Now, COVID is the one part in this that hasn't gone up as much as the other ones, but we're starting to see new subvariants move in that we think could get around some of our vaccines and some of our protection. And so that's the worry there as well. You know, we have these ICUs filled with all 3 of these, like you mentioned, the triple-demic. We don't know where it's going to go, but hopefully we get some of these under control.
Dr. John Torres, thank you very much.
Let's
get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, same-sex marriage is now legal in Mexico, across that country. The last holdout state on the northeastern border has approved it. Mexico's Supreme Court said state laws preventing same-sex marriage were unconstitutional back in 2015, but it's taken years for some states to conform to that ruling. Number 2, officials in Hawaii are warning folks on the Big Island that Mauna Loa is sending signals it could erupt. It's the world's biggest active volcano. Scientists don't think an eruption is like about to happen, but there's been a spike in earthquakes at the volcano summit recently. They want people to get ready. Experts say it could take just a few hours for lava to get to people's homes if it erupts. I covered a lava flow on the Big Island several years ago, 2015 maybe. It moves slow, but it is scary. It is hot. It really affects people's lives. Number 3, ever try to deposit a check and then it bounces and then you get a bounce check fee? Well, the Biden administration is cracking down on what it's calling junk fees ahead of the midterms, part of a bigger effort to try and lower costs for Americans, these kinds of pesky costs. The new measures would limit overdraft fees, bounce check fees, and some other penalties, too. Number 4, we're learning more about Prince Harry's new memoir. Is this in all your group chats? Because it's in all of mine. It's called Spare. which some folks think is a reference to that sort of moniker as he is the spare heir, since he is the younger of the two brothers. Comes out January 10th. Publisher says it's more than 400 pages. Harry says proceeds will go to British charities. Royal watchers have been speculating about this book since it was announced last year. We already have our book club set. Number 5, Thanksgiving is less than a month away, and it looks like turkeys are going to be more expensive. And it's not just because of inflation. Bird flu has killed more than 6 million turkeys across the country. That's like 14% of the total population here, according to the Agriculture Department. Fewer turkeys means the ones who are left are going to be more expensive. Prepare your budget. When we come back, Russia's president says the world is facing the most dangerous decade since World War II. What he's now saying about using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, next. Russian President Vladimir Putin saying today he is not going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Just a day after we saw him monitoring some nuclear drills near Moscow. He says there's no political or military point to using them. It was interesting because it was his most forceful rejection yet of the possibility he could use nukes in Ukraine at a time when tensions are obviously incredibly high because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. In this big foreign policy speech today, rare, it was like nearly 4 hours, right? We see Putin do this occasionally, but not a ton. He also says Russia is not an enemy of the West. He blasted the U.S. and allies and again called Ukraine, in his words, an artificial state. So he thinks the fighting is like a civil war. It is obviously not, as the West sees it. Today, Russian lawmakers also moved to expand a law banning what they call LGBT propaganda. It had applied just to kids, but now it applies to everyone. Under this bill, anything that they say promotes LGBTQ plus values could lead to people getting fined. Human rights groups say it's another attempt to oppress sexual minorities, to basically wipe out the culture in this community. Cal Perry joins us now. So, Cal, let's start. This Putin speech here is really interesting. He talked a lot. He went after the West. That's not unusual. He was sort of feisty, angry, defiant. But he did, no regrets on Ukraine, not that we expected him to have any regrets about invading Ukraine, but he did denounce the idea or say he wouldn't use nuclear weapons because it doesn't make sense.
Right. And look, I think there will certainly be some people here who are happy to hear that. I mean, everybody should be happy to hear that. The question is who's going to believe him, right? I mean, so many people in this country say this is a man. A lot of things he does, people argue, don't make sense, right? Yeah. Yeah. Right. And one of the problems here is, you kind of laid this out perfectly, is then he kind of goes off the rails with the crazy societal stuff. And so people don't know what to listen to. Like, should they take him at face value? Or is this somebody that they just can't listen to at all? The other thing that's happening here is I think people would love to pull something from this speech that's valuable. But so many people here look at it as just more of the same from Vladimir Putin. And your point is an excellent one, by the way, which is that he views this as a possible civil war because Ukraine isn't even a country. Everybody here feels that way. Everybody who's fighting in this war feels like Vladimir Putin doesn't believe this is a real country, that this is a place that is looked down on by Russia, that this is a place that has been abused by Russia for some 8 years. And so I think that bit of the speech people here are going to point to and say, finally, a little bit of truth, Hallie.
Talk about the situation on the ground, Cal, because we've talked about the key city of Kherson there, kind of the gateway to Crimea, and it feels like Ukrainians and Russian troops both are bracing for what could be a pivotal battle in that city.
Yeah, and there's a lot of confusion over exactly what's happening in that city because there's a media blackout and because it's just impossible to get there with how fierce the fighting is. So the Russians have withdrawn to the western side of the river. Now, the Ukrainian army initially said, oh, this is they're pulling back, they're retreating. Now they're saying, well, maybe they're actually reinforcing their lines. The other thing that's happened here is that Russia has taken away all the civilians. And they've said anyone who remains is an enemy and basically can be targeted. So the Ukrainian army, again, is faced with an absolutely impossible task of either leveling the city to get rid of the Russians or leaving the Russians there and hoping they'll withdraw on their own. Either way, what I think so many people in this country wanted to see was video of Ukrainian troops going into this city and liberating civilians. And unfortunately, as you see on your screen, the civilians were loaded onto ferries and taken towards Russia.
Cal Perry, live for us there in Kyiv. Cal, thank you. Good to see you. Coming up, a new warning about threats to elections officials and elections workers. What we're seeing just a couple weeks out, not even 12 days out from the midterms. Plus, the FDNY making history with its new commissioner, the fire department in New York. We'll talk about that later in the local. So a little bit of good news today from a milestone cancer report, finding out that the number of people dying from cancer is actually going down. It's down 2% for both men and women in the last few years. The report basically lays out the trends for new cancer cases and cancer death rates for the country between 2015 to 2019. And it found that not only are cancer deaths down, they're also dropping at even higher levels for lung cancer specifically and for melanoma, down 4% and 5% respectively. So that is objectively, right, good news. Those percentage points represent humans, right, people who are loved by other people. There is a flip side, however. The report found that deaths did go up for the cancers of pancreas, brain, and the uterus among women. It also found cases are going up for younger people, teens, young adults. They're up 9% for people between the ages of 15 to 39. Dr. Natalie Azar is joining us now. Why is that, Dr. Natalie? Do we know why, even though cancer rates are down overall, they're up for younger folks?
You know, I don't think there's one explanation that experts have, unified, Hallie, and said this is definitely why. The incidence of thyroid cancer has definitely increased, and I think that's largely driving that. But I think at the moment, the explanation very likely has to do with obesity, because we know that there are certainly many cancers that are related to that, as well as lifestyle factors. You know, the diets that we eat and the foods that, that we eat and the beverages that we drink, they all play a role in that, Hallie.
What about specifically for some of these cancers versus others? For example, pancreas versus lung.
Yeah, so that those are not the cancers that are driving the increase in younger folks necessarily. We know, and our viewers know this too, pancreatic cancers are notoriously difficult to diagnose at early stages where they are curable. But yes, we have certainly seen that the mortality has increased for pancreatic, for for uterus, especially in women, and for bone cancers and brain cancers, as well as pancreatic and liver in both groups. And again, a lot of that probably has to do with obesity in that age group, older age group, as well as, dietary factors.
So should people be, is there any takeaway that we can have? I mean, as somebody who's under the age of 39, right? I mean, not that, the numbers are all that thing. What should a takeaway be?
So the problem here, Hallie, is that there's not a lot. Let's put it this way. There's about 200 different cancers that the American Cancer Society recognizes. How many cancers do we all get screened for? A handful, right? Women get mammograms and pap smears and colonoscopies. We have improved screening for lung cancer, but there are things like, if we're talking about pancreatic, if we're talking about liver and bile duct cancers, for the average risk individual, there is no protocol to screen for that cancer. If you have a family history, if you have a genetic mutation, very different. Then your oncologist is going to, or whoever's taking care of you, is going to tailor screening a little bit differently, right? And it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. But that's the problem, because a lot of the cancers that we did see an increased incidence of, there is no protocol for screening.
Dr. Natalie Azar, it is an important report. I'm glad you're here to break it down for us. Thank you.
You bet.
NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Western Bureau, more human remains have been found at Lake Mead. The National Park Service telling our Las Vegas affiliate that a dive team found what appeared to be a human bone last week. The Park Service said it did its own search and it found skeletal remains. MPS does not suspect any foul play. Keep in mind, you probably remember this. We've talked about it on the show. This is at least the 6th set of human remains found at the reservoir in the past few months because the drought is keeping water levels low. That's why this stuff's getting found. Out of our Southeast Bureau, Miami Beach is banning race-based hair discrimination in housing, employment, and access to public services. The city says this applies in cases where hair is, in their words, commonly associated with a particular race or national origin, like black communities. It's not clear what penalties people could face for violating the new rule. From our Northeast Bureau, the Fire Department of New York has its first female commissioner ever. Laura Kavanaugh, sworn in as the new head of the country's biggest fire department today. She's served as acting and deputy commissioner already. Kavanaugh will oversee the agency's 17,000 employees. Still to come, our Savannah Sellers talking with some Gen Z college students about living in a post-Me Too world. She's going to take us behind the scenes on this reporting. Coming up in just a sec. Police in Phoenix say they've arrested somebody in connection to a break-in at the campaign headquarters for Katie Hobbs, the Democratic nominee for governor in Arizona. But Hobbs herself isn't really saying too much about it, at least not when our Vaughn Hilliard asked her. Watch.
What was taken from your campaign office?
I'm not talking about the break-in today. I'm not talking about
It's kind of a big deal, though, that your campaign office was broken into.
I think access to safe and legal abortion is kind of a big deal, and that's what we're here to talk about.
Do you have reason?
Now, later today, the Hobbs campaign did release a statement not backing away from this implicit suggestion that perhaps their opponent, Republican Kari Lake, had something to do with it, or that the energy around her campaign had something to do with it. Here's the statement. You can see it for yourself, saying that Kari Lake's preposterous allegation that this break-in was staged is unfounded, and her refusal to condemn the threats that have become common in our politics continues to stoke chaos. Lake has said allegations that she incited threats are absurd. It comes as in New York City, police are raising red flags, warning extremists could target poll workers, political officials, rallies, and voting sites. The DOJ says since 2020, nearly 60% of all physical threats to poll workers were in the states you see there, where results were contested. Joining us now is Ken Delaney. This is such an important graphic that we just showed, Ken, because it is the backdrop to what is going to happen on Election Day, right? And the context to this moment when voters are already starting to vote. Let me sort of start big picture broadly on that point, this idea of threats to elections workers, the people who are doing the jobs of actually getting votes counted.
Yeah, and it's a huge problem, Hallie. I went to a briefing, an FBI briefing on this a few weeks ago, and officials told us that they had received or reviewed around 1,100 or 1,000, I think it was about 1,000 complaints, and 11% of them became criminal investigations. But the problem is these are really hard to solve because many of these threats come in anonymously through email or in phone calls. And so there have been very few prosecutions, and that has led to a lot of frustration among election officials who feel like this is not being given the proper law enforcement attention. The message from law enforcement is they're trying, but it's really hard. And this is about as awful as it's been on this score in a really long time. And it's just a troubling kind of testament to how ugly our politics have become.
Well, on this break-in, we don't know much about the break-in at Katie Hobbs' campaign headquarters, right? We actually know, like, other than that it happened and somebody was arrested, I think we know literally that's it, right? Like, nothing else beyond that at this point. But Hobbs' team has said they faced hundreds of death threats of violence throughout the campaign, right? Leading to the suggestion that there was some sort of political motivation here.
Yeah, and of course, that's the big question, and so far we don't have an answer, although hopefully we should have one soon because the police have made this arrest. You know, it's really hard to know what to make of this incident until we learn more. As you mentioned, the Hobbs campaign blaming the Lake campaign for inciting threats and violence. The Lake campaign suggesting the incident might have been staged. I think all we can say at this point is that it's the sort of thing none of us ever wants to see in our politics. If it does turn out to have been a Lake supporter or somehow related to the Lake campaign, obviously that candidate will have something to answer for.
We talked about the threats to elections workers. The Brennan Center NYU found that 1 in 3 elections officials knew somebody who left a job because of it. I just spoke with the Secretary of State out west for a story that we're going to see next week, who told me that it is a huge concern. She's been working in this business 20 years. She happens to be a Republican who is not an election denier, does not believe that there was widespread fraud in 2020 because there was not. And she was saying this is basically a 5-alarm fire here, metaphorically, at this point. In addition, there's a set of legal challenges, right? 100 of them plus already, which is the most ever before an election, targeting mail-in and early voting rules, among other things. This is thorny and complicated as it relates to the way that there have been concerns lodged by some on the right about this election.
Yeah, there's lawsuits, litigation, both coming from the right and on the left. As you said, experts are saying this is the most sort of pre-ballot litigation that they've ever seen. I think if there's a silver lining here, though, Hallie, it's that what we learned in 2020 is that the courts are the last bastion of sanity. In all those challenges in 2020, the courts decided on the facts and the law, not on rumors and disinformation. And whether the judges were appointed by Republicans or Democrats, the courts took in the evidence and made the rulings as appropriate, and democracy carried on in large part because of that, and we can only hope that that happens again with this election.
Ken Delaney, thank you. Appreciate it. Time now to get the backstory, our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. And tonight, taking a look at Harvey Weinstein, his accusers taking the stand in his LA trial this week, 5 years since the Me Too movement that brought him down really gained traction. In an exclusive interview with one of the first people to publicly accuse Weinstein, Rosanna Arquette told Savannah Sellers she's happy to see the impact that this movement has had.
galvanized the movement amongst globally around the world for women and all survivors. I'm proud of it. Look where we are now. So much work to do.
But for some people in Gen Z, Savannah found that Me Too didn't go far enough.
It was never Me Too when, you know, something happened on a college campus. It wasn't Me Too when someone just went to work at a regular corporate office. It's not Me Too when maybe it's a black man saying that he was assaulted.
Savannah Sellers is joining us now. And Savannah, you know, one of the things that I think people know about you is that you host Stay Tuned on Snapchat, which has a younger audience, right? And I should say, it's lovely to have you on for the backstory, which is really a behind-the-scenes look. Like, it's how did this reporting happen? How did you get to do this reporting? And what was the impetus for this reporting in the first place? Was it the fact that your Stay Tuned audience, like, are members of Gen Z? Did people give you tips on this? Like, how did this come up?
So it partially came up because we wanted to look at this particular moment 5 years in, just at the impact of Me Too. You know, 5 years into a movement that obviously was global, sparked this hashtag, and in many ways did seem to make real change. You know, there are a lot of stats about numbers of executives that were out of a job and then women that replaced those jobs, things like that. But 5 years in, what does it really mean? And so we actually talked through a bunch of ideas. Honestly, Hallie, you know, how do we investigate this in a way that's going to kind of tell us something new or something that might be sort of interesting, something you wouldn't expect. And we thought, you know what, why don't we talk to the generation that's coming in its wake, the generation that was maybe young when it happened, maybe even shielded from it in some ways when it happened. But what do they think now as they're on college campuses, as they're getting their first jobs? I was so surprised to hear, seriously, Hallie, almost literally every single person we talked to, which was a lot of young people across the whole country, say they did not feel that Me Too did anything for them, that maybe they see more conversation in some ways on places like TikTok about things like this, but not actually that they feel more confident in coming forward if they have a story of their own.
So you talked about being surprised to hear that, like, are you a Gen Z or are you millennial? Are you young millennial?
I'm a millennial, yeah.
You're a young millennial. Like, I wonder from, like, because I'm old millennial, right? And the perspectives sometimes are generationally so different, right? And I wonder how much that came into play as you were having these discussions with these Gen Z folks all across the country.
Well, you know what? One of the biggest things was social media, and it was both the positive and the negative of it. And hearing them say, you know, sure, I guess I sometimes see someone talking about their experience on a platform like TikTok, which sometimes surprises me. It still doesn't necessarily feel like the door is open for me. But then where we actually went, and what you'll see in this story tonight that is just pretty dark, that I think a lot of people don't know about, is they are also, which wasn't true necessarily even for me as a millennial. Yes, I grew up with some amount of social media, but not like Gen Z, who grew up with a phone in their hand the whole time, as you know, of course. But they see so much dark content, so much more. It's not just apathy about the movement, Hallie. It is total misogynistic content that goes as far as things like normalizing rape. And they have had to see that. And I think that has a lot to do with it, is the prevalence of social media in their lives and the way that it can be used in this negative way. And tonight we actually dig in also, even on the male side of it, with somebody who was pulled down that rabbit hole, and then them talking about how they got out of it.
Savannah Sellers, I know there's that exclusive with Rosanna Arquette that we talked about too. Thank you for talking to it with us. And you mentioned tonight, we're going to look for more of your reporting tonight on Meet the Press Reports, 10:30 Eastern, right here on NBC News Now. Our thanks to Savannah Sellers. By the way, that's going to be on demand tomorrow on Peacock as well. That does it for us this hour. We happen to be out of time already. We'll have more for you here tomorrow, and we have a whole new fresh hour to begin with. Same time, same place. Good to see you. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.